The Donroe Doctrine was meant to project absolute American dominance. Instead, it may have triggered the most dramatic realignment in North American geopolitics since the Second World War. On January 3, 2026, under cover of darkness, United States forces entered Venezuela and seized its president. By morning, Nicolas Maduro was no longer in Caracas. He was in American custody, transported to New York to face federal charges. It was the most direct U.S. military intervention in Latin America in nearly 4 decades, carried out without United Nations authorization, without congressional approval, and without the diplomatic choreography that once restrained great powers. Within hours, Donald Trump stood before cameras at Mar-a-Lago and declared what he called a new doctrine for the Western Hemisphere. He invoked the Donroe Doctrine, then dismissed it as outdated. According to Trump, America had moved beyond it. This was something stronger, something final. He called it the Donroe Doctrine. His words were blunt and unmistakable. American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, he said, would never be questioned again. Shortly after, the State Department's official account reinforced the message. This is our hemisphere, it said, and the meaning was clear. The Western Hemisphere includes Canada. It includes Greenland. It includes the Panama Canal. And Trump had already signaled interest in all of them. At first, many dismissed it as familiar bravado, another display of rhetorical excess, another moment that would pass. It did not pass. Within 72 hours of the Venezuela operation, the international order began to shift, and the most consequential response did not come from Europe, Latin America, or Asia. It came from Canada. To understand why Canada's response matters, you have to understand what the Venezuela operation represented. The United States did not simply intervene. It demonstrated a willingness to unilaterally remove a foreign head of state, install itself as the governing authority, and transfer control of strategic resources, specifically oil, directly to American hands. At the Mar-a-Lago press conference, Trump made that explicit. Venezuela, he said, would be run by the United States until further notice. American companies would take control of its oil reserves, among the largest on Earth. This was not regime change by proxy. This was direct assertion of imperial authority. And then came the doctrine. The Donroe Doctrine was not an offhand remark. Months earlier, in November 2025, the administration had released a new national security strategy. Buried within it was a formal corollary to the Donroe Doctrine, a written declaration that the United States would reassert and enforce American preeminence across the Western Hemisphere and deny non-hemispheric competitors access to strategically vital assets in the Americas. The document went further. It stated that continued partnership with the United States would be contingent on allies winding down adversarial outside influence. In plain terms, countries in the hemisphere, including Canada, would be expected to reduce or sever ties with China or face consequences. The strategy identified key strategic locations and critical supply chains as priorities. The Arctic, the Northwest Passage, critical minerals, energy corridors, assets that, notably, lie within Canadian territory. One analyst summarized Washington's view succinctly. Access to these assets could no longer be contingent on Canadian permission. This was not speculation. This was official policy. And the signals kept coming. The Secretary of State went on television and declared that the Western Hemisphere is where America lives and where it will not tolerate rivals. When asked about potential military action in Colombia, the president responded casually, "Sounds good to me." He issued threats toward Cuba. He warned Mexico's president in crude terms. He labeled Colombia very sick. Then came Greenland. A senior presidential advisor posted an image of Greenland draped in the American flag with a single word beneath it: soon. When pressed on whether force was on the table against Greenland, a territory governed by Denmark, a NATO ally, the administration refused to rule it out. Denmark's response was historic. For the first time in NATO's 77-year existence, a member state publicly warned that if the United States were to move militarily against another NATO country, the alliance itself would collapse. Everything would stop, Denmark's prime minister said, including NATO. That statement alone should have set off alarms across North America. For Canada, it was impossible to ignore. Trump had already referred to Canada as a 51st state. He had imposed crushing tariffs on Canadian goods. He had mocked Canada's leadership and described the bilateral relationship as something to be dictated, not negotiated. And now, his doctrine explicitly declared the Western Hemisphere an American sphere of dominance. Canada was no longer an ally by default. It was a strategic asset to be managed or absorbed. Former Canadian diplomats said it plainly. Canada, they warned, was on the menu. Against that backdrop, Prime Minister Mark Carney's initial response to Venezuela appeared restrained. He spoke of hope for democracy and peace while emphasizing the importance of international law. Critics accused him of weakness, of caution, of failing to stand up to Trump. They missed what was happening beneath the surface. While Carney avoided public confrontation, he moved decisively behind the scenes. His first major trip after Venezuela was not to Washington, but to Paris. There, at a summit of more than 30 countries coordinating support for Ukraine, Carney stood alongside European leaders and alongside Denmark's prime minister. From that stage, he announced that Canada would send its Governor-General, Mary Simon, an indigenous Inuk leader, to Greenland. Canada would also open a new consulate in Nuuk. The symbolism was impossible to miss. As Trump threatened Greenland, Canada sent an indigenous representative of the Arctic to stand in solidarity with Greenland's people. Carney stated it directly. Greenland's future is a decision for Greenland and Denmark alone. Days later, Canada joined 6 major European powers in issuing a joint declaration affirming Greenland's sovereignty. The message was unambiguous. Canada was aligning with Europe against American coercion. Then came the deeper shift. Canada announced it was finalizing participation in a multinational security guarantee for Ukraine, alongside more than 35 countries, not under American leadership, under a European-led framework. This was not symbolic alignment. It was structural. Months earlier, in December 2025, Canada had quietly become the first non-European country in history to join the European Union's flagship defense initiative, known as SAFE, a massive program designed to rearm Europe through joint procurement, shared financing, and integrated supply chains. Through SAFE, Canadian defense companies gained access to European military contracts. Canada gained the ability to purchase weapons jointly with European partners at scale. European capital could now flow directly into Canadian defense industries. And Carney made the strategic intent explicit. More than 70% of future Canadian defense spending, he said, would no longer go to American suppliers. That was not an adjustment. It was a break. Canada was restructuring its military-industrial base away from the United States and toward Europe. The scale was extraordinary. Over $80 billion in new defense funding over 5 years. Immediate compliance with NATO's 2% spending target. Long-term alignment with a 5% target by 2035. Massive investments in Arctic infrastructure, surveillance, and year-round military presence. Canada was preparing to defend its sovereignty in the Arctic, not with American help, but independently of American pressure. The Arctic is where everything converges. The Northwest Passage, long claimed by Canada as internal waters and by the United States as an international strait, had been managed quietly for decades through diplomatic compromise. Trump's doctrine effectively declared that compromise void. Access would no longer be negotiated. It would be asserted. Beneath the ice lie critical minerals essential to modern technology, rare earths, lithium, cobalt. Canada possesses nearly all of them. Trump's strategy explicitly called for securing access to critical supply chains in the hemisphere, even if that required pressure or unilateral action. This is economic imperialism written into policy. And here lies the ultimate irony. Trump's aggression was meant to exclude rivals, particularly China. Instead, it is pushing America's closest allies toward diversification, toward Europe, toward Asia, toward alternative partnerships. Canada has reopened high-level dialogue with China for the first time in nearly a decade, explicitly stating the need to reduce dependence on the United States. Never put all your eggs in one basket, Carney said. We have too many eggs in the American basket. Faced with an impossible triangle, maintain U.S. relations, resist Chinese influence, and preserve sovereignty, Canada chose sovereignty. What we are witnessing is not a temporary dispute. It is a structural transformation. Trump's doctrine rejects the post-1945 order built on alliances, trade integration, and shared rules. It replaces it with spheres of influence, dominance, and coercion. But in doing so, it is accelerating the very outcome it sought to prevent. America's allies are learning to hang together. Without America, Canada is no longer positioning itself as a satellite of U.S. power. It is becoming a middle power with its own alliances, its own defense base, and its own strategic autonomy. The Donroe Doctrine was meant to show strength. Instead, it may come to be remembered as a moment American influence in its own hemisphere began to erode. Canada is watching. Canada is preparing. And Canada is building alternatives. An America consumed by its own assertion of dominance may not realize what it is losing until it is already gone.